welcome to Man Enough. I'm Justin Baldoni.
I'm Liz Plank.
I'm Jamie Heath.
And look, we're not a current event show.
Mm-mm.
This is not a news show. This is a podcast that focuses on masculinity. However, there are certain times, and unfortunately, it's happening daily and weekly, where current events and the conversation around masculinity are intertwined and enmeshed, and we would be remiss to not do a special episode specifically this week about gun violence and how it relates to masculinity and how it is gendered. And so what I hope and what I'm going to ask of you, if you are listening to this, if you are somebody who is triggered, pun intended, by the conversation, somebody who maybe believes in the right to bear arms and thinks that this conversation is merely political, I would encourage you to stay in the room, which is something that we talk about a lot. If this was maybe sent to you by somebody that cares about you, encourage you to just listen, just as we are. When lives are at stake, the least that we could do, and perhaps the most manly thing we could do, is to shut up and listen, to maybe hear somebody else's point of view and be willing and open to let that into our hearts. So with that, Liz Plank, can you tell the audience a little bit about Jackson Katz, who is our incredible guest today?
Yes, we wholeheartedly couldn't think, of anyone who's better to speak on this issue than Dr. Jackson Katz, who's been on he's a friend of the Man Enough Pod. He is an educator. He's an author. He's a social theorist and academic who's internationally renowned for his pioneering scholarship and activism on issues of gender, race, violence, and particularly masculinity. He's just the foremost expert on all of this. So he has a TEDx talk that's called Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue, and it has 5 million views. It's very good if you haven't seen it already.
So good.
He's the co-founder of the multiracial mixed gender Mentors in Violence Prevention program. So he basically pioneered the bystander approach when it comes to violence against women. He's just been a major figure, thought leader in calling for gun safety. And he actually was the first person to write an article in a mainstream media outlet 23 years ago in the Boston Globe after the Columbine shooting. He was the first to really link gun violence to masculinity. And this week, he published a really important call to action in Ms. Magazine that really encourages us all to look at the ways that guns are woven deeply into cultural narratives about American masculinity.
No, it's good we've got him right now to share his thoughts and to maybe put some ideas for us to all think about and consider.
Yeah.
So let's jump in and hear from him.
Let's do it. We'll be right back. This is Man Enough.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Hey everyone, the sun is coming out and small businesses are back in business, and LinkedIn Jobs makes it easier for you to grow your team. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the people you want to interview faster and for free. In fact, true story, we over here at Man Enough found 2 amazing producers on LinkedIn Jobs to join our team for season 2. Yeah, I said it. We are doing a season 2. Did you know that you can create a job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people? Then you can add your job in the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring so your network can help you find the right people to hire. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs number 1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/manenough. That's linkedin.com/manenough to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, and welcome back to the Man Enough podcast. Today, we have Mr. Jackson Katz. Jackson, thank you so much for joining us. It's unfortunate that you are with us today, but we're so grateful that you are with us today. Before we dive in, I know you're making time to do this. You're about to go give a speech, probably about this very thing. How is your heart this morning? How are you feeling?
Well, I'm hopeful that we're having this conversation, and honestly, that there are increasing numbers of people who are having these kinds of conversations. I mean, I think there's a lot of bad news in the world these days, and as somebody who directly deals with that, in my work, issues of violence and war and peace and rollbacks of fundamental rights and school shootings and mass killings, and it seems like pretty overloaded all the bad news, but there are better worlds possible, and that we don't have to just accept the status quo, and working on these issues with folks like yourselves makes me feel hopeful, even though it doesn't mean that I'm
it's such a beautiful outlook, is to be hopeful. Okay, let's just dive right in, because something that's confused me, Liz writes about this a lot in her book. Jackson, you've been talking about this for years, is it almost feels like we're willing to look at every possible reason that mass shootings and gun violence happen, except the gendered reason. We can look everywhere, to mental health, to access to guns, to all of these things, but it's almost like people can't say men commit these acts of violence, even though we know that it's like 99%, 98% men. Can you just walk us through, as if we are students in your classroom, of why we cannot separate violence, specifically gun violence and mass shootings, from masculinity, and how they're interconnected?
Sure. Well, thank you, Justin, for even for opening up the space for the conversation. I think the central factor in school shootings, for example, is gender. We can talk about mental illness. We can talk about personality disorders, of course. We can talk about, obviously, the availability of guns. Those are all important pieces of the puzzle. But I think gender is the central factor. And what do I mean by that? I mean cultural ideologies and beliefs about manhood that shape boys and men's understanding of themselves as men and their relation to violence, and violence as it's connected to both the performance of manhood and the means by which men and young men are trained and taught to gain something or to take back something that's been taken from them. One of the ways that I talk about school shootings in particular, in the way of making the case that gender is the single most important factor, is a little thought exercise. Imagine if 99% of school shootings were done by girls and young women. Would anybody be talking about mental illness on the one side or gun availability on the other before talking about the fact that girls were the ones doing 99% of the shootings?
They would have removed the ability for women to buy guns.
Right,
after the second shooting, women would have no rights to even buy a gun after the second shooting. That's what would happen.
Exactly. And everybody would be talking about the fact that it was girls doing it, and that it wouldn't be like a second level analysis. It would be like the first thing people would say. What is it about femininity? What is it about cultural ideas about girls and womanhood? What is it about the particular life circumstances that girls and young women find themselves in that cause some of them, a small number, but some of them, to act out in this way? But because boys and men represent the dominant group, the dominance goes invisible. And so I think part of what we need to do, those of us who are concerned with shifting the paradigm, is we need to make visible what has been rendered invisible. And this is historic. I mean, this isn't just a recent phenomenon. The whole idea that when people hear the word gender and think it means women, or, I mean, I know that's shifted with the trans challenges to heteronormativity, but people often hear the word gender and they think it means women. People hear the word race, they think it means, African American or other people of color. People hear the word sexual orientation, they think it means, LGB. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get attended to, as if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category, or as if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation, or as if men don't have a gender. Because, in other words, if you represent the dominant group, you are in a sense representing the norm against which others measure themselves. And the way this plays out is that this invisibility cloak, if you will, prevents people from thinking about, for example, men as gendered beings. A lot of people think, oh, men are just people. Women, they're the ones who have a gender. They're the ones who are influenced by gender issues, or people of color are the ones who have a race. White people are just people. And that's part of it. By the way, another way to think about this, Justin, is if it was about guns and gun availability on the one hand or mental illness on the other, why aren't 50% of school shootings done by girls? Girls have every bit the access to guns that boys do. Girls have every bit the mental health challenges, but a vanishingly tiny percentage of girls act out in this way. The point is, it's not just about gun availability or mental illness or personality disorder. It's about how gender interacts with that. Mm-hmm. And I think, to me, one of the key questions is, why are we so reluctant to say this out loud and have a discussion about it? Why is the mainstream media in the United States, in particular, so reluctant to say out loud that this is fundamentally about masculinity and boys and men's understanding of themselves as gendered beings, as men, as young men, and then have a conversation about it like we're having right now? But I have to say, I've been beating this drum, and others have, since the 90s, and it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating that I'll give an example. The New York Times did a piece just about 2 weeks ago, not even.
Yeah.
After the Uvalde massacre, where it was a front page story that actually included discussions about the gender of the perpetrator and some of the reasons why that's important to talk about. But you know what the article was about? It wasn't about the gender. It was about the age of the perpetrator. So the headline was, why are so many young people doing these crimes? And then under the headline of, age, in the body of the text or the body of the article, there was some discussion about some of the particularly gendered aspects, but it didn't even merit a headline. And I'm talking about 20 years of school shooting media coverage. It's rare to see anything close to an honest discussion about the fact that boys and men are doing it, and then asking questions about why.
Why won't we talk about it? Why are we so afraid to say that it's a gender issue? What's behind that?
Well, I mean, one reason that we're so afraid is that it gets the core issues of identity of the dominant group. What we're really talking about is having the dominant group, men. And again, I know that men as a category includes a whole range of differences and hierarchies. We're talking critically about the dominant group. And I think a lot of men in particular, not only men, but a lot of men are filled with anxiety about talking about this, about introspection, about thinking about their own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. And by the way, the ways that many of us who in a million years wouldn't, commit some kind of mass shooting, but nonetheless, we participate in a culture that helps to glorify and valorize violent masculinity. I mean, look at Hollywood films or video games, violence as it's connected to core narratives about American manhood. That's like mom and apple pie, isn't it? In other words, violent American masculinity is almost like redundant, because the narratives about American manhood, especially in this case, white American manhood, but not exclusively, are deeply woven into the fabric of sort of American identity. And by the way, the gun as an implement and as an accessory for men, if you will, has been so deeply woven into the cultural and historical narrative of America, and certainly American masculinity, that to then critically examine it, I think a lot of men, either consciously or unconsciously, don't want to go there. So in other words, it's easy to say that the shooter is some sick individual, he's some crazy person, he's some pathological monster, because that then gives us some distance. We don't have to think about, okay, wait a second, maybe that is a monstrous act that person created, but that perpetrated. But you know what? It's not instructive to think about these individual actors as completely divorced from the culture that produced them. And the culture that produced them has a very long history of violent masculinity. And men have been violent in our society, whether it's the slaughter of Native Americans by the original white European colonial settlers, the slavery as a form of institutionalized violence and brutality that was largely controlled by white men. The level of violence that's in our cultural DNA and men's violence is so deep and profound that I think that some people, whether they're conscious of it or not, don't want to open up that can of worms, because then you have to start talking about all the ways in which both our history as a country and a civilization, and to the present day, the ways that we identify as many of us as men, has to be under the critical spotlight. And I think there's some real reluctance to do that. And by the way, last thing is, I think that there's a lot of defensiveness, because I think a lot of men do feel that any critique of these things is an attack on them. And so as a result of thinking it's an attack on them, and some women, in fact, participate in this because they don't want their sons being criticized or being attacked, or they understand that men are more complicated than they're not just killing machines, they're human beings, all of which we all know this. But as a result of this defensiveness towards any critique of masculinity, a lot of people don't even want to open up the can of worms. And so a lot of women, for example, I talk to women all the time who say to me, oh my God, I'm so happy you're saying these things. I'm so happy a white man is saying these things, because when women try to say these kinds of things, and Liz is an exception, by the way, because Liz has been so out front in talking about this stuff. But a lot of women, including feminist women, don't want to say this stuff out loud because they don't want to get attacked for being anti-male, for ganging up on men. And so they sort of back away from it. And then a lot of men feel like if they have this kind of conversation, they'll be seen as somehow being traitors to the brotherhood.
Traitors to our own gender, exactly.
Right, which is total BS. And by the way, most victims of gun violence are men and young men, but they're the victims of other men and young men's violence. And the idea that somehow it's anti-male to talk critically about the gun culture and the obsession with violence as an expression of masculinity, that somehow it's unmanly to do this, is total BS. And I'll say that as emphatically as I can. And I think that we need more men, especially in this current moment, who have the guts to say that out loud and not be afraid that somehow you're going to be unmanned as a result.
Be man enough. Exactly.
Man enough. You're not going to be man enough. It's the exact opposite. Is that it takes more strength and self-confidence if you happen to be a man to say, this is messed up and you're not going to do this in my name. I'm not going to, for example, as a white man, I'm not going to be silent as other white men carry AR-15s to state houses to prove that they're manly, or attack the Capitol with guns because they couldn't win in a democratic, small d democratic election. They're going to use violence to get what they couldn't get peacefully. I'm not going to sit silently and let them speak for me and say that that's what men do, or that's what white men do. No, that's what white men who are completely not meeting the moment of our historical times that we live in. That's what men who are trying to hold back the tides of democratic change and historical progress. That's what those men do. Doesn't represent me. And I know that I, as a man, and I think you all too, and you can speak for yourselves, obviously, I think that I speak for a lot of people. I think there's an awful lot of men who are sick of the violence and who are outraged by all these shootings and these mass killings. A lot of them don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to be effective in counteracting it. But I think it's part of the counteracting is opening up space to talk about how cultural ideas about manhood are at the heart of the problem.
Jackson, everything you're saying is so true. And you were really one of the first people to, after Columbine, which was now several decades ago, you actually were the first person to write an article in a mainstream newspaper tying this to gender and masculinity. And I'm sure it must feel frustrating for you to keep having to push to have this angle, but your work is certainly working and reaching people. And I think we are at a really interesting point where almost every huge problem that we have in our society, we can tie it to this unhealthy ideal that we have of masculinity. Even in the January 6th hearings, what we've heard is that the Proud Boys, which is an organization that is really assembled and organized around an unhealthy ideal of masculinity. Now we know that what instigated it, the first person that actually broke the barricade, said a slur related to masculinity to a cop, basically questioned his manhood. That should be a headline, right? Like that to me, when I learned that. And to your point about mental health, I think it's so important to talk about this because, there was a really good interview with a clinical psychologist that said, you can fix mental health with medication, with therapy, right? There's ways to actually cope with these issues, but we're not, when we're talking about school shooters, they don't fall into these categories of bipolar or having depression or anxiety. Actually, they are not able to treat them with pure sort of mental health or clinical sort of ways that you would address that. So in order to fix this problem, we actually need to go far beyond that and to look at these issues of entitlement, to look at these issues of, people who think that they're owed something. And why do so many young men think that if they're not reaching this ideal, that somehow other people are responsible for that? So I'm just curious, from your perspective, how can we talk about masculinity in a way that people can receive it? Because you've been doing this for a very long time. I think a lot of people feel defensive. How do we start?
Well, thank you, Liz. I think one of the ways is we need adult men to be part of the conversation. We can't put the pressure on boys to open up space to talk about stuff when adult men aren't. And that means adult men who have influence in the lives of boys. And that could be in a personal level, whether it's fathers, uncles, grandfathers, coaches, teachers, obviously. And then in the public culture, in other words, we need to model, those of us who are adults need to model the fact that this is part of being a man, is being honest, being introspective, having the courage to look inward and talk about the complexities of your emotional life. And by the way, it's important, and that way, if young boys see adult men doing that, it creates some space for them. And by the way, those of us who are adults, we have to create those moments too. We can't wait for boys to ask us to talk about this. We need to initiate the dialogue, both on an interpersonal level, if we have boys and young men in our lives, but also if we have institutional authority, like we're, superintendents of school districts, principals of high schools, teachers, coaches. We need to create the space for those kind of conversations. I also want to say, just to get granular in terms of the motives of school shooters that doesn't get talked about in the mainstream. Most school shooters are boys who have been bullied, marginalized, ridiculed, or shamed in some way, and they develop a revenge fantasy, because most school shootings are revenge fantasies enacted, and they develop a revenge fantasy. They figure out a way to get guns. They often, and which is not hard to do in this gun crazy culture, they often give indications in the comments that they make, whether it's on social media or to other friends, about what they're planning to do, in part because the whole thing is a performance. They're trying to reclaim their manhood, their sense of themselves as the agents of their own life. And we have data. This is not like some theoretical, construct here. We have data of real school shooters who haven't either killed themselves or been killed by police. By the way, many school shooters are doing it as a suicide murder.
Yeah. These are suicides.
They're murdering others, but they're also taking themselves out. But some don't. And the ones who have either, survived their school shooting, and then we can get data from them in subsequent interviews, or those who left manifestos or writings behind, journals and others. This comes up over and over again, that what they're doing is using violence redemptively to regain something, to redeem their manhood. Now they're going to be in control. They've been pushed aside. They've been ridiculed. They've been mocked. They've been disrespected, but now they're going to be respected. And we have so much, not just from school shootings, we have so much data and common sense suggests that when people have a gun in their hand, especially, for example, think about a boy or a young man who's invested in the idea of masculine strength, but he's always been picked on and ridiculed. Now he has a gun in his hand, or a big AR-15, and people are backing up. People are scared. People are like bowing to his will. It's an inebriating sort of power that he's feeling, right?
Yeah.
Think about that. And by the way, that's another reason why I think people are really uncomfortable with talking about this, because it's not just about school shooters that we have to talk about as boys and young men. We have to talk about, what is the whole gun rights movement about? What is the whole movement? Why has our country been so pathetic in a global scale? Why are we the international embarrassment because of related to gun policy all over the world? People think we're complete barbarians. The level of gun violence that we have, that we allow, the laxity of the laws that allow an 18-year-old to walk into a store and buy a semi-automatic weapon with high-capacity magazines that can kill dozens and dozens of people in a short time. We have to have an honest conversation about how manhood and cultural beliefs about manhood lead a significant sector of our population to believe that their manhood is invested in owning a gun. And if you look at the data about why people own guns, I mean, there's a complex set of reasons. There's hunters, there's target shooters, but there's also this notion of man as protector of his family. And you'll hear this narrative over and over again. You're not going to take my guns away from me and take my ability to protect my family away from me. In other words, it's about his manhood. It's not just about some abstract Second Amendment discourse. This is about core issues of identity. And by the way, women who buy guns are often doing it not to protect their family, but to protect themselves, because they see their vulnerability to men's violence and feel like the only way that they can compensate for the lack of physical size and strength differential vis-a-vis the men who might assault them is to own a gun, which is the great equalizer in that context. So why aren't we having this conversation? Why don't we talk about, why does a white guy, for example, put on camouflage uniform in an urban setting? And by the way, camouflage in an urban setting calls attention to yourself. It doesn't make you blend in. You put on camouflage and
it makes you feel more
gun.
masculine because of the images of masculinity of men wearing camouflage.
That's right.
It's a wardrobe. It's a costume.
But isn't that the key, right? Like that is associated with strength. And even the way that we talk about school shooters, it is representative of what you're saying, which is like they come in, people are bowing down, we're afraid. Is the way to do it to tell a story about how weak that is to do that as a man?
Yes.
And how weak it is to not have laws about gun rights. It's not barbaric, it's weak. Like to talk about it in the framework of masculinity.
I would say, Liz, you're onto it. And I would say instead of saying it's weak, we have to redefine what it means to be a protector. Yeah. So for example, are we really protecting our kids? Yeah. Are we really creating a society where people are feeling safe? Isn't it the exact opposite? Isn't the current regime of gun laws and the accessibility of guns creating a situation where we're failing to protect our kids? And isn't there a better way to be a protector than to just say everybody should have a gun at any moment? And I think if we say to men, especially men who are not already bought into this caricature, what I think is a cartoon caricature, a cartoonish version of manhood. I'm not saying that we're going to change that. A guy who puts on a red MAGA hat and with an AR-15 and goes to a state house to try to intimidate the state legislature into passing certain kinds of legislation or intimidate protesters from actually exercising their First Amendment rights. By the way, that's the other thing. People have a right to protest, but if you bring a gun to a protest, you're stifling someone's First Amendment rights because the fear of violence is then muting their voice because people don't want to be shot. So therefore, you could say that you have the right to carry that gun because the state of such and such allows you to carry that gun. But the fact of carrying a gun to a small d in a democracy, to a public protest, is an act of intimidation and violence, even if you don't pull the trigger, because you're using the threat of violence to get your way. So you're using the threat of force to get your way, which is frankly, it's a violent act. And it's a suppression of other people's freedom because other people don't have the freedom then to express themselves because they're worried they're going to get shot. And is this what we want? Is this the democracy that we want? And I would say to men, especially, who see themselves as the protectors of their family, and I appreciate that. I mean, I think adults should be the protectors of their family. Adults, not just men. But if you're an adult man, I have no hesitation to say part of your responsibility is to protect your family. But is the only way that you can think of to protect your family to arm yourself to the teeth? Is that really the best way in the 21st century to be a protector? And so I think what needs to emerge is a competing definition of what does it mean to be a protector? And I think passing gun policy and restricting access of guns, especially with high-capacity magazines, semi-automatic weapons, is a form of protector masculinity. And yet, I think a lot of men who are in that sort of realm are afraid to say some of this stuff out loud, in part because they're worried that they're going to be criticized as being soft and weak and not strong. And listen to Donald Trump's rhetoric. The rhetoric on January 6th, for example, was all about we need strength. That's what we need to take back our country. We need strength. It's all coded references to the manhood of his followers. And if people don't see that, the January 6th insurrection, of the people who were arrested for crimes committed during that day, 93% were white and 86% were men. But the mainstream conversation about the insurrection was that it was a white riot. It was white people who were outraged about, the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of the country, who can't handle that and want to take back control of the country and the narrative of America, if you will. But guess what? 86% of them were men. So it wasn't just white people. It was overwhelmingly white men.
Yeah.
And if you look at the videos, I mean, it's right there in plain sight. It's like these are men who are performing a certain kind of heroic, what they see as a heroic masculinity. They're going to take the side of the great leader who invokes this notion of strength to take back our country, Donald Trump. I mean, it's all absurd on some levels, but it's the gender subtext needs to be brought into the foreground.
Yeah, they're called the Proud Boys. I mean, it's even it's like we don't even need to.
By the way, you don't have to assert pride. Last thing, you don't have to assert pride unless what? Unless you have felt shamed. So that even the very name Proud Boys suggests that what these guys, even though they're extremists, they teach us something. That there's a certain percentage of white men who have felt shamed by the discourse of. Yeah. The progressive discourse, the feminist discourse about white men as, the occupying too much space in the culture and everything else. And pride is an assertion in the face of shame. And so even though the Proud Boys are, like I said, a small group and an extremist group, I think if we study what motivates these young men to get involved with the Proud Boys, it'll give us a great insight, not just to them, but to larger forces in the society and the culture.
I do have a statement and then a question. I believe in the equality of men and women for sure. I don't necessarily think that we are the same. I don't think equality means sameness. I have experienced myself with kids and cousins. What I want to do is unvilify, not that you or any of us are doing this, the idea that the only reason why someone may want a gun is to feel powerful. When I was a kid, it was fun. I like target practice. I like bowling. I like throwing a ball down a lane and hitting targets. In the backyard, taking a gun and shooting BB guns was nothing about trying to feel masculine. It was just a fun thing to do. So as we get older, and I have kids like my son that's 5 and my daughter who's a year younger, they're 6 and 5. He is drawn to wrestling and doing things that are, more rough. And she's not. Now, a lot of us can say this is cultural and cartoons that throw things, and that is for sure. But also, since they were young, he likes to wrestle and roll around differently than her. So there are certain things that he, not only him, in my experience, that boys might be more drawn to as a gender than women or girls. So what I'm wanting to understand is as boys get older, and yes, there is this whole masculine thing to feel powerful, but is it not also that for boys, it makes sense? I don't think anything wrong with it. Yes, I keep saying that there are crazy people that do it and it's only mentally ill and such. But for most of us, we're not trying to feel powerful to wear camouflage. It's fun. It's fun to dress up. It's fun to do this. So maybe for many people, because they are told you're this, you are that, you're that, they're not then able to look at the root problem. Because they're defensive first, because they feel attacked for just being, who they are. That's maybe not necessarily attached to power. And I'm not dismissing that idea, but how do we address that for so many people that we know throughout the world that are decent, wonderful people that stand for women's rights, that stand for being kind and loving, and also it makes sense to them that guns are okay.
Let me just say, I mean, this isn't about taking away something from men, like their ability to be, playing aggressive sports and, rough and tumble. I was a football player. I mean, I understand fully all of this. This is about sane policy around killing machines. Guns are extraordinarily violent and dangerous weapons, and they have to be respected and understood as that. And gun owners are going to have to be at the forefront of that policy change. It's going to be gun owners who are going to say, we are outraged that a small extremist minority has been able to create laws under this guise of it being about freedom, which is, I don't believe that for a second. I don't think this is about freedom. This is about sanity. I believe in freedom as much as anybody. The question is, how do you define freedom? And by the way, the other thing is, I think this is the overarching point, is how do you define strength? To me, we need to give young men and men, adult men, ways of being strong that are not directly connected to the use of violence or the threat of violence as the only definition of strength. Yeah. So we have to encourage men to think about moral courage, social courage, speaking up in the face of injustice, challenging a bully non-violently, but speaking up and assertively demanding that people be treated with respect and dignity, including yourself, without using violence. I mean, in other words, some of these school shooters probably had real bad things happen to them. It wasn't their fault that they were bullied or that they were victims of child abuse or neglect. They should be, embraced in a certain sense. But the moment that they took that gun in their hand and they started killing people, then of course that's completely crosses a line completely. But do we need to reach out to boys and men and both say, we honor and respect your need to be, rough and tumble and to enjoy yourself. And there are uses of guns that aren't toxic and abusive. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important, especially if you want to get people to go the next step in the conversation. Because if they feel like everything about them and everything about what they enjoy or identify with is being ridiculed, is being toxified, then they're going to shut you off. And I agree with that. But lots of people have been saying, lots of people, young men around the world have, including in, say, in wealthy countries that are similar to the United States in socioeconomic sort of wealth and educational levels, they'll say, kids have plenty of problems. Kids get bullied. Kids have, problems in their families. They have problems in their peer cultures, but we don't have all these mass shootings, but you do. And why do you have all these mass shootings? Well, we do because we have gun culture that has gone way beyond target shooting or having BB guns in the backyard and shooting bottles. And we have 18-year-olds be able to walk into a store and buy a military style, semi-automatic weapon. Oh, by the way, can I also say before we even conclude this conversation, I think it's important to acknowledge another piece of this, and feminists, Liz has been on this, a whole bunch of feminist writers and thinkers and journalists have been talking about this. The misogyny and the men's violence against women that is connected to gun violence is very, very important to acknowledge and to theorize and then to do something about. In other words, well over half, in some cases, 2/3 of men who commit mass shootings are also domestic violence perpetrators. And some of those mass shootings are domestic violence incidents themselves. But a lot of these young men who are school shooters, they'll kill members of their own family, like the Uvalde shooter who shot his grandmother. Adam Lanza killed his own mother in their home before he went to the Newtown school to kill. What is going on with the conflation of men's anger and resentment towards women and the misogyny that underlies that, and by the way, their fear of feminization, because a lot of the men who commit these mass shootings and the young men have fears of being emasculated and made to seem like women. In other words, if being seeming like women has been so degraded in a sexist culture that they will commit acts of violence to prove that they're not women. I mean, how can we talk about the subject of gun violence and not talk about misogyny and not talk about issues related to gender equity on the other side of the house?
I just would love to understand and hope that the world can recognize that we don't let your average person have a bomb, but we recognize people can have firecrackers, and that's fine. They can have an M80, but don't have bombs, because if it's in the hands of the few, it would cause such mass destruction. We recognize nobody can have bombs, and no one's arguing like, my right, I should be able to have a bomb. We understand that lives, mass harm is more important than you owning a bomb. Right. I don't understand why, for people that want guns, good, keep your guns, all good. I don't love the idea, but if you want guns, have them. Okay, let me not argue that point. But can you also not see that for the few, more than a few, that get these particular weapons, it causes such mass destruction? Why is that so hard to just say, you can't have it? Just like a bomb, just like things, but have your guns. Why can't they be separated?
Yeah.
This, Jackson, I think we need to have you back, and maybe we can do a part 2 at some point. There's so many conflating ideas and points here that just, you can't really separate all of these things, and it's all a mesh together. And nobody talks about it better than you. So we know you have to go and run off to a speech. So thank you for your time, and hopefully you can come back and you know what, maybe we can even have audience questions for you the next time you come on, specific to this type of thing, because I'm sure there are.
Thank you. I'd be happy to do that. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue, even though I know I talked a lot, but the
that's the point.
The frustration, I have to say, the frustration of some of us over the last several decades. This is not a new conversation, but yet we those of us in certain circles take some of this stuff for granted. It's so obviously about manhood. It's so obviously the gun rights debate is so obviously subtextually about American manhood, especially white American manhood. The idea, the motives of the shooters in the school shootings is so clearly connected to their gender sort of sense of themselves as boys and young men and men, and yet not being able to talk about any of that in the popular conversation, turning on, CNN and having, you see conversations all the time. I've been watching them and critiquing them for, 25 years. And then no one even says out loud the stuff that we've been talking about just now. You don't have to agree with every point that I or Jamie or Justin or Liz makes. You don't have to agree with everything. You could disagree with fundamental pieces of it. But why aren't we having this conversation?
Yeah.
I think we'll find that if once we open up the space for the conversation, the changes that have to happen are much more likely to come next. Because once you open up the conversation, you start realizing, this a lot of this makes sense, but what doesn't make sense is the status quo. And the status quo, I hope that everybody listening thinks that the status quo is unacceptable. And little kids being murdered on the streets of the United States and in their schools and people in supermarkets and in churches being murdered with guns that are made for military style engagement on the battlefield. It's not sane social policy, and it's not evidence of a healthy culture. And I think that if we can have more voices saying that and having an honest dialogue about it, it's only to the good. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jackson. Thank you so much,
Jackson.
We will be right back. This is Man Enough. Hello and welcome back to Man Enough. Wow, Jackson Katz, what an incredible guy. Jackson and his work, I'm sure Liz is similar for you, has profoundly impacted obviously my work and influenced so much of even the language that I use in developing this idea of what man enough is, that challenge to men. Like, can you be man enough to this, right? To stand up for, gun control, despite it affecting possibly your masculinity. One of the things that I kept thinking about as he was talking was the difference between masculinity and femininity. And that just by being a boy, growing up in America specifically, and I want to siphon the conversation to America because, as we know, the data shows that we are just simply the worst at this. But every single day growing up as a boy, unconsciously, subconsciously, I had to prove that I was a man. It's the basis for this podcast. It's the basis for the books. It's the basis for this movement. I had to prove since I was 4 years old that I was a boy, because there was other boys telling me that I wasn't, based on something that I did, something that I would say, based on an attribute. And it's not just me, it's every boy. So we grow up in a culture where every single young boy at a young age is taught to distrust and hate femininity, because the worst thing that can happen to us as boys is that we're called a girl, right? Homophobia, called gay. And we grow up hating those parts of ourselves, hating girls, honestly, even though we like them. And I have to prove to myself every single day with the P word in the patriarchal society that I'm enough, that I'm man enough, that I'm a boy enough. And then when I'm bullied, which I was relentlessly as a young boy, I have to find a way to get that power back somehow. So what did I do as Justin? I bullied. I became a bully myself because it would hurt less. So when you're thinking about gender, so as we're thinking about gender as it relates to masculinity and school shootings and mass shootings, we cannot remove that, as Jackson was saying, because that is literally the only way these boys and men are claiming their power back in a society where it's okay for men to be stripped of their identity simply for existing as men. It's not something that we talk about. So we're so damn afraid to link gender to violence and school shootings, because even in doing so, this is how fucked up it is, excuse my language, even in doing so, we are risking being a traitor, as he said, to our own gender.
Mhm.
Literally, I can be bullied for standing up against bullies, against gun violence, against sexual harassment, against rape, against abortion rights, whatever it is. I can literally be bullied and I can lose my masculinity. Therefore, I am no longer a man and I am the worst thing that I could possibly be, which is either a woman or gay.
Oh, I was just going to say, also the idea that you have to reclaim that power. You have to be told that you're owed power in order to believe that you should be reclaiming it, right? It is not, right? Like, and I think that's what needs to also be really defeated, in our society, because the people who are going out and, sort of doing this, right? Who are going out and committing school shootings, it's not trans kids who actually are powerless, right? In many ways in our society. It's not young girls who are being threatened, with the risk of sexual harassment and abuse. And right. It's not actually the person at the bottom.
Boys.
Right. And so we need to talk about that power structure, to talk about, and that's why it's not mental illness, right? That's not a mental illness. That's societal programming that can be undone if, to Jackson Katz's point, we can actually have this conversation. And I think that if you're listening to this and you disagree with some of the things that we're saying, that's a good thing. Because a conversation doesn't mean, everyone agrees. A conversation means that people who disagree come together and that we're able to talk about this. But to Jackson's point, we're not even able to have that conversation. So I'm inviting people who, feel defensive or feel, uneasy or uncomfortable. Like, that's great. That means you're listening. That means we're talking, and let's go. Let's talk about this openly so that we can actually come up with good solutions to this problem. That's why we haven't solved it.
We're afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, you can't talk about the solution.
I also think that, so Jay, a lot of what you had said, I agree with. There's a bunch that I don't.
Right.
Speaking to all the mothers and the fathers that have boys that are 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 years old, I don't believe that my 5-year-old and that all my cousins, they're his friends, are going out in the world every day trying to prove they're boys. I think inherently they're noble and they're good in their hearts and loving. So for parents who are looking at their boys, hearing us have a conversation like this, we're not saying that your child at 4 and 5 years old is not just wonderful. And I think it's not as extreme. I don't think it's as blatant as every day they're being told this, all the time they're being told this. I think it's subtle stuff that messes with
subtle
us.
Stuff. That's what I'm saying.
It's the little things that just that boys are exposed to growing up that eventually start to infiltrate their thoughts. And then they become 8, 9, and 10 years old, and then faced with hormones, and then faced with seeing the world and what it means to take care of and be a husband and be a boy in the world or man in the world. How do I, all these things. And then you're infiltrated with some of these images and thoughts that then shape us in a way that when we're faced with choices, faced with how to resolve matters with other people, that we then sometimes resort to those maybe animalistic ways that can be harmful. So I would say most everyone listening, and we don't want mass shootings. We don't want people to be hurt. You want to protect those around you. I really believe that most people are like that. Why is it that we feel like my right to own this is more important than the right for people to be safe against weapons like this? I think most people can understand this concept, but what is it that gets in the way of them understanding that concept and then, acquiescing to it versus this idea of I have to stand and hold on to it?
The thing that's stopping, I believe, most people and most men is the fear of being a traitor to their own gender subconsciously, of being a traitor to a entire political party or an entire system, to their friends. Because I know a lot of gun owners who believe in the right to bear arms that don't believe that AR-15 should be available.
Of course.
And the problem is that by standing up and saying that as men, they are risking being emasculated by other men who say, who would bully them. And this is why it goes back to the 4-year-olds, the 5-year-olds, the 8-year-olds, where it's not a conscious thing that we're thinking about having to prove that we're boys. But when my 4.5-year-old comes home from school and he starts saying there's a boy who's 5 in his class who he's cool, he doesn't cry, he fights, he can beat anybody up, he plays video games where he shoots people. This is what's starting at 5. And then suddenly that becomes cool. That becomes the thing that my son wants to then be. This is where it starts. And then, of course, as you get older, then the power dynamic comes in. It doesn't necessarily start with boys having to prove they're more powerful than other boys at 4 or 5 years old. Boys just want to be accepted and liked and loved like everybody else, right?
Sure.
All genders want the same thing. We just want to be accepted and liked. But unique to boys is the power situation, because they are, as Liz talked about, we are, those of us who identify as men, we're told that innately, specifically white men, Jamie, because I know it is different for black folks, that power rests in our hands and we have a right to it, especially here in America.
Yeah, I agree.
It's subconscious.
I think you guys agree.
Yeah.
We do agree. There's these blanket statements sometimes that I feel can cause someone then to just
for sure
put the wall up, right? And I just want to be mindful of that in the way I articulate it. There are a lot of men who I wish thought differently, but it doesn't necessarily mean because they're protecting their manhood. It's because it makes sense to them. They believe I should have that right. And it's only crazy people that such and such. It's not because I'm trying to protect or I think I'm masculine. It's because it makes sense. How do we not challenge that issue and say, like, how do we make it make sense to you?
I agree completely. It's the words that we use.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, right, as you've said to me, as Liz has said to me, as other important women in my life have said to me, it's like sometimes we have to use those words.
Oh yeah, I don't have a problem with the words. I hear you.
And like as an example, that's why we don't say toxic masculinity per se on the show very often, because we know what it does and how it divides. But when you're talking about like gun rights as an example, we've reached this point where it's no longer just political jargon. We have to save our children. And but yes, we want to find a way to have...
And that the people doing this are children too, as Jackson pointed out, which I think is, we need to want to protect all children being victims of this and also being perpetrators, right? And this whole idea of wanting to protect boys in the same way that we want to protect girls. But I also feel like we should leave people with resources and things that they can do, because we've been, talking about it as one thing, and that's what we really believe is important.
Yes. What can we do, Liz? What can we do?
Tell us.
Yeah. All kinds of organizations that people can join, whether it's Everytown or the Sandy Hook Promise. There's marches. There was one last weekend. And you can keep up with where your local marches are by following those groups and just systematically voting. Things can feel helpless. Like, people can feel helpless by thinking nothing's changing, but things are changing. I think we have to talk about this in the way that we also talk about climate change, right? Where there's a lot of frustration. There's way too many people who are dying from this, but there are people in government who are trying to change this and supporting those people, supporting their campaigns, and just talking about it with your friends, posting about it on social media. I believe it makes a difference. And even in your personal life, if having these conversations with your family members, with your friends, they're going to listen to you more than they will listen to anyone else. And so you actually have a lot of power. And so I encourage people to use it.
And thank you, Liz. And look, and to Jamie's point, just because you, let's say you were a gun owner, believe that you want to protect your family as a man, it does not make you bad or wrong. I want to protect my family. What we have to ask ourselves is, who are we protecting our family from?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's not, and I'm sorry, but it's not women.
Agreed.
It's not women.
And while you have the right to protect, and I understand that, oftentimes we say, then what is the other side of that? By having that right, what is the potential damage that it does in other areas? And sometimes we sacrifice. There are rights that I am willing to sacrifice if it means that others are protected, that the world is safe. So even if I wasn't arguing with you that you should have a right to have this and have that, like, let me just say that maybe you do deserve that right. Let's just say that for the moment. But if that right comes, the consequence is so much destruction. Why would we not be willing to say, I can forego a right or two for the betterment of all? That seems reasonable.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for listening. This conversation doesn't end here. If you have any thoughts or any questions, please DM us, comment on the video, and maybe we'll have Jackson Katz back and have have a part 2. As always, if you like our podcast, please like and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us at manenough.com/podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Justin Baldoni.
I'm Liz Plank.
And I'm Jamie Heath. And Justin, you shared some stuff about your experience as a boy and being bullied and how you then responded. And I went straight into some other thoughts, and I didn't acknowledge that and hear that. I'm really sorry that that was some of your experience, and I'm proud of what you've become and how you've dealt with it. Thanks for sharing that.
I love you. I love you. And whoever you are listening, I love you too. We'll see you next time.
Next time.